That morning, I shaved with extra care, adjusted my old blazer, and in my hands trembled a small box holding the locket that had belonged to her mother. I was on my way to my daughter's wedding, certain that despite all our differences, my place would still be beside her on her important day. But at the gates of the church, a neighbor stopped me and quietly said, "Don't go inside." His words burned me with their coldness, and when I finally stepped over the threshold, the bride froze, as if she had seen a ghost. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Arthur Milton. I was 74 years old, a retired postal clerk from a small town in Pennsylvania. For nearly 5 decades, I sorted envelopes and packages with the steady rhythm of someone who believed in routine more than ambition. I knew the zip codes of our county better than I knew the names of most of my daughter's friends. I wore the same brand of shoes for 30 years, kept a pocket calendar in my shirt like it was sacred, and brewed my coffee each morning with the same dented percolator that hissed like an old man trying to clear his throat. That morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body was trained like a machine. My bones cracked in the quiet bedroom as I sat up. The air had that early September chill, the kind that settles in your joints and doesn't let go. The radiator hadn't kicked in yet, and my slippers felt cold when I slid my feet into them. The floor creaked under my steps, just like it always had since I moved into this house in 1982. I went through my usual routine with slow, deliberate movements. I shaved with my old safety razor, the kind that still needed actual blades you had to replace by hand. My skin didn't take to it like it used to. There were nicks on my chin, little red warnings that I wasn't young anymore. I washed my face with cold water, staring into the mirror above the sink. My reflection looked like a stranger who knew me too well. Deep lines around my mouth, sunspots scattered like confessions across my forehead, and eyes that had grown soft with the passing of time. On the back of the bathroom door hung a towel embroidered with my late wife's initials, EM for Eleanor Milton. I had never taken it down. I used a different towel, left the embroidered one untouched, as if her absence still demanded its own space in the house. The scent of lavender still clung to it faintly, preserved by silence and habit. I inhaled it without meaning to, and it clung to my chest like a weight. Downstairs, I prepared a small breakfast: 2 slices of toast, 1 boiled egg, and a cup of black coffee. I didn't bother with butter. I hadn't kept any in the fridge since Eleanor passed. It always went bad. The ticking wall clock above the fridge, an old promotional item from the post office, shaped like a mail truck, clicked with an uneven rhythm. I had meant to fix it for years, but never did. I guess part of me liked that it was broken the same way I was. The kitchen table still had a small stack of envelopes I hadn't opened. Most were ads or utility bills. One of them was the invitation to the wedding. Cream cardstock, cursive font, a little bit of gold leaf trim. "You are cordially invited," it began. I had read it so many times the fold had worn thin. There was no handwritten note, no personal message, just the printed formality of someone doing what's expected. My name was on the envelope, but not in the heart of the sender. On the chair beside me sat a box. Inside was the gift I had decided to bring, a silver locket that had belonged to Eleanor. She had worn it on her wedding day, and every family photograph afterward. Inside it were 2 tiny portraits, one of her and one of our daughter, taken when she was 7 years old. I had polished it the night before, sitting by the lamp with a faded rag and a bit of cleaner that smelled like old pennies. The locket gleamed with quiet dignity, and when I held it in my hand, it felt like holding a part of both women at once. I dressed slowly, my best slacks, the navy blue ones I had worn to Eleanor's funeral, a white shirt that still held the faint scent of cedar from the closet, and the gray wool blazer with frayed elbows that I kept only for important occasions. I checked the fit in the hallway mirror, and noted how the blazer hung looser than it used to. Age had taken some weight, but not the burden. The tie I chose was dark green with small paisley patterns. Eleanor once said it made my eyes look kinder. I slipped my feet into polished black shoes. The leather creaked as if in protest. I knelt, slowly, carefully, and tied the laces. On the small shelf near the door, next to a faded photograph of Eleanor holding our daughter in her arms, sat my wristwatch. It was a Timex with a cracked face, a gift from my co-workers the day I retired. The second hand ticked unevenly, but it still worked. I strapped it on and checked the time, even though I already knew it. My internal clock was never wrong. Before stepping out, I paused by the front door. I took the locket from its box and placed it into the inside pocket of my blazer. I didn't know whether I'd have the chance to give it to her in person, but I knew it had to come with me. I looked around the living room, the threadbare armchair, the row of ceramic birds Eleanor collected on the mantel, the stained carpet that had outlived 3 dogs, and felt a deep ache. It was the ache of someone who had lived inside memories for too long. Outside, the wind was sharp. It carried the scent of damp leaves and gasoline from a neighbor's mower. The trees had started to turn, red and orange freckles appearing on their edges. I stood for a moment on the porch, looking out at the quiet street, the mailboxes lined up like soldiers, and the empty driveway where my daughter used to learn how to ride a bike. I remembered her first fall, the scrape on her knee, and the way she looked at me, not crying, just confused, like she didn't understand why the world could hurt. I locked the door behind me and slid the key into my coat pocket. I wasn't sure when I'd be back, or if. The sidewalk beneath my shoes felt firmer than usual, like it knew the weight of the moment. I walked past hedges I hadn't trimmed in months, past the corner where Eleanor used to wait for the bus to church, past the mailbox I still checked out of habit, even when I knew there was nothing inside but silence. I reached the end of the block and stood at the curb, waiting for the bus. The bench was cold, the metal biting through my trousers. I held the locket in my hand, rubbing my thumb over its surface like a ritual. When the bus arrived, I climbed on with effort, nodded to the driver, and took the seat near the window. The town rolled past slowly, familiar but distant, like an old friend who had stopped calling. I watched as houses blurred into storefronts, and storefronts into the brick facade of the church. I could already see the people gathering. Bright dresses, pressed suits, someone carrying a bouquet. My daughter's wedding day. I was there. I had made it. And yet, even before stepping off the bus, I felt it. The distance, the quiet, the weight of something unspoken, waiting for me at the door. The bus pulled away behind me, a slow exhale of diesel and tired gears. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk outside St. Mary's Church, letting the sound of its departure fade into the wind. My knees ached from the ride. The concrete beneath my shoes felt uneven, warped from decades of frost and sun. I steadied myself with a palm on the old iron fence that surrounded the church grounds, chipped black paint flaking into my skin like dry leaves. The church looked almost exactly as I remembered it from years ago, when Eleanor would bring our daughter here in her Sunday dress, hair braided in 2 ropes down her back. The stained glass windows still shimmered in the sun, like fragments of a quiet promise. I could hear the muffled murmur of guests inside, polished shoes on tile, coughs quickly stifled, distant laughter, and the faint hum of a string quartet tuning up. Everything smelled of lilies and old wood, the kind of mix that makes your chest tighten if you're already holding something in. I adjusted my blazer and stepped closer to the gate. The black iron arch had always leaned slightly to the left, like it was bowing under the weight of too many memories. I reached for the latch with my right hand, my fingers dry and trembling, when I heard footsteps crunching behind me on the gravel. It was Mr. Halverson, my neighbor from 2 houses down, retired Navy, the kind of man who kept his lawn symmetrical and his mailbox freshly painted, even in the dead of winter. He walked slowly, his hands tucked behind his back, as if inspecting a parade. His face looked pale under his cap, and his lips pressed into a straight, unreadable line. He stopped a few feet from me. I nodded at him out of habit, the way you nod at people who've seen you shovel snow in your bathrobe or pick up your trash can when the wind knocks it over. He didn't nod back. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear him at first over the distant swell of music inside the church. So I took a step closer. Then he spoke again, and this time I heard it clearly. That one sentence dropped like cold rain inside my ear. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen halfway between resolve and confusion. My fingers hovered over the latch. The gate creaked slightly in the wind, as if it too had paused to listen. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me said enough, eyes filled with something between pity and warning. I had seen that look before. Years ago, at Eleanor's funeral, on my daughter's face, in the mirror. My grip loosened. I stepped back from the gate, heart suddenly louder than the music. The sharp breeze rustled the hem of my blazer. I reached into the inside pocket, feeling the locket still there, solid and cold, like a forgotten truth. Behind Mr. Halverson, a group of younger guests arrived in a flurry of perfume and high heels. They brushed past him, chatting, adjusting suit jackets, one woman laughing too loudly. None of them noticed me. No one looked in my direction. It was as if I had already become part of the landscape, just another old man with nowhere urgent to be. I looked down at my shoes. A smudge of dirt had settled on the right toe. I rubbed it off with a handkerchief, more from reflex than care. I had polished them that morning, kneeling on the faded welcome mat at home, using the same brush I'd kept since my wedding day. I had thought it mattered. Mr. Halverson remained where he was. He didn't move toward the church. He didn't move away. He just stood beside me, like a quiet reminder of something I hadn't yet understood. I turned my eyes toward the heavy oak doors. They were half open, and through the narrow space I caught a glimpse of white fabric. Her dress, maybe. The kind Eleanor would have chosen. Simple, elegant. A small silhouette moved near her, someone adjusting a veil or whispering last-minute words. I felt heat rise in my face, but it wasn't anger. It was the sensation of being uninvited, not rejected in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quieter kind that makes you question whether you were ever really wanted at all. The smell of flowers wafted out as the doors shifted. Lilies, definitely. Eleanor had hated them. She used to say they smelled like hospitals. Our daughter never knew that. The music inside swelled again. Violins warming up, a cello humming low. Time seemed to slow, each second dragging like syrup. I felt like I had been there for hours, though the watch on my wrist ticked normally. I checked it out of habit. 2:13 p.m. The ceremony was to begin at past. Mr. Halverson finally broke the silence between us. He gave me a short nod, like he had completed his duty, then turned and walked away, without another word. His shoes made soft thumps on the gravel, and then he disappeared behind a parked car. I stood there, alone. Cars lined both sides of the street, satin ribbons tied to mirrors, cans clanking softly on one bumper already. Wind tugged at the program lying on the grass near the fence. I bent down and picked it up. It was printed on thick paper, the names in elegant cursive. Her name was there. So was his. But mine was nowhere to be found. No mention of the father of the bride. No giving away. No seat of honor. Just space. Blank, like omission was easier than explanation. I folded the program and placed it in my coat pocket. I took one slow breath, deep enough to hurt a little, and stepped forward. My hand returned to the gate, this time with a different kind of steadiness. I didn't look around. I didn't wait for someone to stop me again. The latch clicked under my fingers. The metal was cold. I opened the gate and walked inside. My hand remained in my coat pocket as I stepped past the gate, fingers wrapped tightly around the locket. It was small enough to disappear into my palm, but heavy enough to anchor everything I was feeling. I hadn't taken it out since I left the house. I didn't need to see it to know it was there. I could feel every curve, every ridge of its engraved surface. Eleanor's initials were on the back, delicate and worn from years of being touched, kissed, kept close to her chest. I had polished it the night before with a dry cloth and an old toothbrush, carefully working the silver until it reflected the lamp's glow like still water. The wind picked up slightly as I made my way across the church lawn. The blades of grass were wet from a morning drizzle, and my shoes made a soft brushing sound against them. Each step felt rehearsed, like I had walked this exact path in my mind 1,000 times. The church loomed ahead, its doors wide open now, revealing soft candlelight and the murmur of voices, hushed but dense, like layered linen. I stopped under the arch of the church entrance, just short of crossing the threshold. The smell of lilies hit me again, sharp and layered over the fainter scent of polished wood and beeswax. The air inside the church was warm, but I hesitated. I withdrew the locket slowly from my pocket and cradled it in both hands. It hadn't always belonged to Eleanor. It was passed down from her mother, and from her grandmother before that. The chain had been replaced once, the clasp twice, but the locket itself remained the same, a small oval of silver with a tiny hinge and a clasp that clicked shut with the softest sound, like a sigh. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, one of Eleanor at 25, on our wedding day, her eyes calm and knowing. The other, our daughter at 7, standing in front of our mailbox with a bouquet of dandelions. I remembered taking that photo. She had been waiting for the mail truck with Eleanor, and when I pulled up, she ran toward me, laughing, wild hair bouncing. The bouquet was for me. I had tucked it behind my ear, and Eleanor took the picture just before the wind scattered the yellow heads into the driveway. It was the kind of moment you don't think to treasure until time does the treasuring for you. The photos had faded over the years, the edges curled slightly. I had thought of replacing them, but something always stopped me. They were imperfect, yes, but they were real. They had lived in that locket through every move, every fight, every silent breakfast after Eleanor's diagnosis. I had once watched her sleep with it, still around her neck, as though it were a tether to everything she feared forgetting. And now, it was mine to give. I had told myself, even after the silence grew between my daughter and me, that I would one day place it in her hand. Not with words, not with explanation, just place it there, let her feel its weight, and maybe understand what it meant. I believed, in the deep part of me that still held on to rituals, that it would mean something. That objects, unlike words, did not distort. The chain slipped through my fingers like thread through a needle. It was cool against my skin. I rubbed my thumb along the clasp, opened it gently, and stared at the photos again. I didn't smile. Smiling would have felt false, too easy. I only looked. Let the ache settle in its place. From inside the church came the shuffle of bodies, the clinking of glass, the subtle crescendo of string music adjusting its tempo. I could hear footsteps, heels on marble, children's shoes tapping too fast, and the occasional cough. Somewhere behind all that noise was my daughter, dressed in white, with the whole room turned toward her. I wondered if she was thinking of Eleanor. I wondered if she had any memory of the locket at all. I turned it over in my hands one last time and breathed against the silver. It fogged slightly, then cleared, like a window into the past. I closed the clasp with a soft click and returned it to my pocket. I took a few steps forward and entered the church. No one turned to look at me. I moved along the edge of the pews, unnoticed, like a shadow stretching across a wall. The stained glass glowed behind the altar, casting soft hues of red and gold across the aisle. I kept my gaze low, not from shame, but from preservation. I didn't want to search the room for her face and find it turned away. I took a seat in the very last pew, close to the back door. My hands folded together loosely in my lap, but my right hand remained near the pocket with the locket, guarding it like a lit match in the wind. I stared at the programs resting on the pews in front of me, each neatly placed, tied with a thin ribbon. The paper was thick and clean. I ran my finger across the embossed lettering, tracing names that carried none of mine. Above the altar, a large wooden crucifix hung against the stone wall. Its shadow fell across the floor in a long diagonal line, stretching toward the guests like a silent warning. I wondered if anyone else noticed. Probably not. People see what they expect to see. They hear the music, admire the flowers, wait for the moment the bride enters and changes the mood of the room. But I sat there, measuring time not in minutes, but in the rhythm of my breath, the pulsing in my fingers, the silent repetitions of names I hadn't spoken aloud in years. The candle closest to me flickered, caught in a draft from the open door behind me. I looked over my shoulder once, briefly. The door remained ajar, as if offering me an escape should I decide this wasn't the right moment after all. But the locket was still in my pocket. Its weight hadn't changed, and neither had my decision. I sat straighter in the pew and waited, not for her to notice me, not for forgiveness, just for the moment when I would know it was time to give the locket back to the story it came from. And whether or not she took it was never the point. It was the act of carrying it here, across years, across distance, across silence. That mattered. I sat in the last pew, the kind that creaked when you shifted your weight too quickly, the kind that felt like it had absorbed decades of prayers and unsaid regrets into its wood grain. The varnish had dulled, smoothed down by the backs of coats and restless hands. I kept mine folded in my lap, though the right one twitched occasionally, grazing the inside of my jacket where the locket lay like a secret I hadn't yet spoken aloud. The music had changed. It was softer now, measured, reverent. A violin held a single long note that seemed to bend in the middle, stretching time like melted glass. The candles along the aisle flickered unevenly, reacting to the shifting air as more guests moved into place. One child cried briefly, then was hushed with the sound of cloth rubbing against skin. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I knew what was about to happen. The bride would enter soon. I leaned slightly forward, my forearms resting against my thighs, and watched the open doors at the far end of the sanctuary. A shaft of light poured in from outside, cutting a clean line across the dark floor tiles, the kind of light that made you think of late afternoons in empty rooms, of days when time felt slower and more forgiving. From my seat, I could see the outline of the entryway, the heavy oak doors, now pulled open and pinned into place with metal braces. The polished stone threshold, worn slightly in the center where thousands of shoes had passed over it. The arrangement of flowers just inside, white roses and baby's breath curling out of tall vases like breath from a sleeping body. The roses were a sharp contrast to the lilies scattered throughout the rest of the church. Eleanor never liked roses either, said they were too proud, too staged. But I could see why they were chosen. They were clean, flawless, a symbol you didn't have to explain. The air in the church grew still, expectant. A few guests turned their heads subtly toward the entrance, as if they had been waiting for this cue. The quartet adjusted its pace, smoothing into a slower tempo, the opening strains of something romantic and classical, something safe. I felt my breath catch for a moment, not because I was nervous, but because I knew this was the last quiet second before everything tilted. Then I saw her. She stepped into the light first, before fully crossing the threshold. Her white dress seemed to catch the sun at just the right angle, glowing not from sequins or embellishments, but from the purity of contrast, white against shadow, memory against time. Her veil floated behind her like a trailing cloud, and for a moment I felt the world narrow into a single point, her silhouette framed by the arched doorway. She took one step forward, and then she saw me. I wasn't supposed to be in her line of sight. The guests were all turned forward, toward the altar, toward the officiant, toward her future. But I had unknowingly placed myself in the exact sight line between where she entered and where she was meant to walk. Our eyes met in that stillness, and I saw her expression falter. She froze. Not dramatically, not the kind of pause that draws gasps or commentary, but subtly, enough that only someone watching closely would have noticed. Her left hand, holding the bouquet, tightened. Her posture stiffened. One foot lingered behind the other, as if reconsidering its next movement. My stomach turned cold. It was not joy that crossed her face. It was not surprise in the tender way that welcomes. It was something else entirely. A glitch in the narrative. The insertion of something unresolved into a day that was supposed to be polished and perfect. I saw the flicker of recognition shift into something harder to name. Discomfort, perhaps, or disbelief. But I didn't look away. The silence in that second rang louder than any music. Then the moment passed. She blinked once, swallowed, at least it looked like she did, and resumed her steps down the aisle. The guests rose to their feet in unison, rustling against the pews like dry grass, and the music swelled to cover whatever had just happened, whatever we had both seen in each other's eyes. I remained seated. It was not out of protest. I simply didn't trust my legs. The weight in my chest felt heavier than the locket, heavier than the years. I reached for the pew in front of me, gripping it lightly for balance, and forced myself to keep my gaze level. I would not turn away. I had come too far for that. She walked slowly now, measured, the kind of walk taught by rehearsals and nerves. Her dress swept the aisle behind her, whispering across the floor like tide on sand. Beside her walked someone, her uncle perhaps, or a friend of the family, his expression composed, unaware of the static that had filled the air seconds earlier. I watched them approach the altar, watched her pause as instructed, watched her take her place in front of the officiant. I could no longer see her face clearly. The veil had slipped forward slightly, casting a soft blur over her features. She looked calm again. She looked as though nothing had happened. But something had. I remained still for several minutes after the ceremony began. The readings, the vows, the laughter that scattered like dust across the polished floor. All of it moved around me, but not through me. I was a fixed point in a room designed to forget me, and I accepted that, not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of relief. Because I had crossed the threshold. That had been the moment. Not the wedding, not the speech I hadn't been asked to give, not the toast that would never bear my name. The moment had been that single step forward, through the doorway, into her line of sight, into the truth of where we stood. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, at the way my fingers curled slightly inward. My nails were clean, freshly trimmed. I had prepared myself not for celebration, but for clarity, and I had received it. I closed my eyes briefly and listened to the sound of her voice, faint, formal, rehearsed, as she repeated the words of commitment to a man I did not know. Her voice hadn't changed much. It still had that upward lilt at the end of phrases, like a question waiting to be answered. But now she was answering herself, closing the circuit, drawing the line. I opened my eyes and exhaled, long and slow, the way Eleanor used to do after long silences. The church light shifted as a cloud passed over the sun, dimming the stained glass momentarily. The candle beside me flickered again. I leaned back into the pew, let the creak echo behind me, and settled into the quiet understanding that some thresholds, once crossed, are not for celebration. They are for remembering what still matters, and what never stopped. I sat there in the pew, still and quiet, surrounded by people who moved like I wasn't even there. The ceremony had continued without pause, its rhythm uninterrupted by the static that had passed between my daughter and me. Vows were exchanged, rings placed on trembling fingers, and somewhere in the air above it all, applause scattered like dry seeds on stone. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, a soft gasp of joy rolled through the guests. People leaned in to whisper, women reached for tissues, and cameras clicked in synchronized bursts. I watched through the flicker of candles, my hands resting lightly on my knees. I hadn't moved since I entered. My legs felt cold, not numb, just absent, like I had borrowed someone else's body for this day. As the couple turned to face the guests, a wave of attention rippled backward through the church. Heads turned, shoulders shifted, eyes swept the room from front to back. And that was when they saw me. The first face I recognized was Mrs. Ellingsworth, a friend of Eleanor's from the church choir. Her mouth opened slightly when she met my gaze, but she quickly closed it, lowering her eyes as if to erase the moment. Then came another, someone I didn't know, maybe a cousin on the groom's side, maybe just a neighbor. But their eyes did the same thing, a flicker of surprise, quickly masked with politeness. It was a strange kind of recognition, the kind that made people uncomfortable, not because you were unwelcome, but because you reminded them of something unsaid, like a photograph taken down, but not destroyed. A silence they thought would last longer than it did. Some turned to whisper, some didn't. A few pretended they didn't see me at all. The woman in front of me, maybe in her 30s, with hair pinned in a careful twist and a perfume that smelled like lilacs and something metallic, angled her body slightly to the side, as if shielding herself from my presence. Her date noticed and followed her gaze. When he saw me, his expression didn't change, but I saw his fingers tighten around the back of her seat. These weren't angry looks. That would have been easier. These were looks soaked in discomfort, layered with unspoken context. They were the kind of looks people give when they aren't sure if you've come to mourn or to disrupt. They were calculating, cautious, assessing the social damage of my presence in real time. I didn't flinch. I just looked back. It wasn't a challenge. It was simply the only thing I had left: eye contact. I met their gazes with the calm of someone who had already braced for rejection, who had accepted that judgment would come not in words, but in glances, passed, like folded notes. I saw one woman nudge her husband, whisper something close to his ear. He glanced over his shoulder, caught my eye, then turned back, stiffening in his seat. I wondered what she said. Probably nothing cruel, just factual. Probably just my name, Arthur, and maybe a phrase to clarify. Her father, still alive, unexpected. My daughter and her new husband began to walk down the aisle, and the guests turned with them, pivoting to watch the procession. I felt the movement rush toward me like a wave, the whole room aligning around their exit. As they passed by, I didn't stand. I remained seated in the final pew, as if rooted in place. She didn't look at me, not once. Her eyes stayed forward, focused on the exit, on the path ahead. Her hand clutched his arm tightly, and her smile was flawless. The veil had been lifted, and her makeup was untouched. Not a crack in her performance, not a flicker of recognition. If I had been a stranger, I would have thought she was just nervous. But I wasn't a stranger, and that absence of acknowledgement felt surgical. When they reached the doors, the guests followed, like a school of fish turning with the current. More people looked at me now, some with curiosity, a few with sympathy. One elderly man, he might have been at my retirement party decades ago, offered me a nod, small and slow, like the pull of a tide too old to be resisted. I returned it, not out of courtesy, but because I needed something in that moment to anchor me. The candle nearest my pew had burned down an inch. I stared at the wax pooling around its base, dripping into the metal dish like time made physical. The flame danced slightly, reacting to the breeze of people passing by, each figure casting a different flicker of shadow across the pew. When the church began to empty, I waited. I didn't want to leave with them. I didn't want to be part of the crowd. I needed the silence. I needed to hear my own breath again without the press of glances folding around me like hands closing a book. I leaned back, the pew creaking beneath me, and closed my eyes briefly. I imagined Eleanor's voice, not saying anything specific, just humming. A tune she used to repeat while watering the plants, while folding towels, while watching our daughter play in the yard. It was always the same melody, tuneless yet complete. I could almost hear it above the footsteps echoing down the marble floor. Eventually, the church fell quiet again. The music had stopped. The candles flickered in peace. A few late guests lingered, whispering at the far end, their words soft as feathers. I opened my eyes and stood slowly, knees crackling like old vinyl. I walked toward the aisle and paused, my hand brushing the edge of the pew one last time. The wood felt warm, as if it had remembered the weight of everyone who had leaned on it. I stepped into the center of the aisle and looked down the length of the church, the long path that everyone had walked, that I had never been meant to touch. I took one step forward, not toward the altar, not toward the exit, but just to feel what it meant to stand in the middle again. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the remnants of perfume, wax, and floral arrangements, and let the stillness settle around me. There had been no words, but the looks had said enough, and sometimes that was louder than anything spoken. After the church had emptied, I remained where I stood, mid-aisle, the weight of it all pressing into the soles of my shoes like I was standing on something that didn't want to hold me anymore. The doors had swung closed behind the last pair of guests with a slow, dragging sigh, like the lungs of a tired cathedral releasing the final breath of ceremony. The echo died gradually, swallowed by the ancient wood and stone. And then came the silence. It was not the kind of silence I had known at home after Eleanor passed, nor the kind that settled on snowy streets in the early hours. This was deeper, thicker. It had shape and gravity. It clung to the pews, hovered above the extinguished candles, filled the high rafters where dust motes floated like forgotten time. I stood there and let it gather around me. The altar glowed faintly under the dimmed chandeliers, their bulbs humming with that barely audible buzz that only becomes noticeable when everything else has stopped. A single bouquet had been left on the steps near the pulpit, an accidental orphan of the day's joy. A petal had fallen beside it, curled inward, already beginning to dry. My feet ached, not from standing too long, but from age, and the way regret settles in the body like slow cement. I moved to the side of the aisle and lowered myself into a pew, third from the front this time, not by choice but by instinct. The wood was smoother here, less worn, as if fewer people had sat in this particular spot. It smelled of lemon polish and something older, maybe incense, absorbed into its grain from decades of ceremony. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight ahead. The large crucifix on the wall above the altar stared back at me with a stillness that mirrored my own. There was something different about the way it hung now. Maybe it was the angle of light, or the absence of people, but it no longer looked like a symbol of redemption. It looked like a question, something hanging where certainty used to live. The silence began to throb in my ears, a low pulse that reminded me of late nights in our old house, when Eleanor's breathing was the only thing that made the darkness bearable. I would lie awake sometimes and just listen, counting the spaces between her inhales. After she died, I found myself still doing it, waiting for a breath that wouldn't come. I rubbed my thumb against the inside of my palm, a habit I picked up in prison after Eleanor's funeral. When the world had gone too loud inside, I learned to find rhythm in something small, something I could control. That motion came back to me now, involuntary, almost childish. I reached for the locket again. Its weight grounded me. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The images inside were etched into me already, more permanent than the silver that contained them. I just held it between my fingers, thumb pressing against the cool metal surface, index curled under its hinge. It felt like a pulse, something alive inside an object. Outside the stained glass windows, the light shifted. The sun had begun to lower, dragging long shadows across the aisle. One of them reached my feet and slowly climbed my legs like a slow tide returning to shore. I imagined what the church would look like in an hour, empty, cold, maybe a custodian sweeping the aisle, collecting programs left behind like litter after a parade. Would he wonder who had sat in this pew? Would he notice the imprint I left behind? I didn't move. Somewhere above me, the rafters creaked with the sound of old timber adjusting to temperature, to memory, to time. I thought of my daughter again, not as she had looked today, stiff, composed, unblinking, but as she had once been. 7 years old, face flushed from running through the sprinklers, a popsicle melting down her fingers, and her hair sticking to her temples in little damp curls. She used to jump into my arms without hesitation, used to crawl into our bed on stormy nights and bury her face in my chest. She used to believe I could fix anything. Then came the years that undid all that. A fight over college, a silence after Eleanor's death, a letter returned unopened, no calls on birthdays, no messages on Christmas. Then the invitation, mailed, not spoken, addressed with formality, not love. And even that felt like a clerical error, like the kind of thing you send out of obligation, not hope. I was here, but not part of it. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands dangling between them. My watch, the old Timex Eleanor gave me before our 25th anniversary, ticked with a faint, irregular rhythm. The crystal was cracked, a fine spiderweb of time and carelessness. It ticked anyway, relentlessly, like truth. The silence persisted. It had weight, texture, layers. In it, I heard every word that hadn't been said, every apology not offered, every gesture withheld. It pressed into me like a confessional, but no priest would come to hear this. There was no absolution here, only observation. I closed my eyes. Behind the lids, colors danced from the stained glass. Phantom reds, blues, greens, refracted by memory and tears I hadn't allowed to surface. The locket pressed into my palm. I let it remain there, like a question I no longer needed answered. Eventually, the sound of a door opening at the far end of the church echoed faintly. A click, a creak, a breeze. I didn't turn around. Whoever it was, they had come too late or too early. I was no longer interested in interruptions. I breathed in deeply. The scent of melted wax and flower stems, of perfume gone stale in the air, of the room's age and its endless holding of people's secrets, all of it mixed and settled in the silence, like sediment in a glass. And I let it. I let the silence fold around me until it became a blanket, not a blade, until it softened the hard edges inside me that had cut against time for too long, until I remembered that sometimes the absence of noise wasn't loneliness. Sometimes it was the only place you could still hear what mattered. So, I sat, and I listened. I left the sanctuary quietly, long after the music had stopped and the last of the guests had trailed out. The candles had burned down to pools of wax, and the shadows had deepened, drawing the walls closer. I walked along the aisle slowly, my hand grazing the edges of the pews as though each one could remember who had once sat there. My shoes tapped softly on the tile, echoing like footsteps in an empty museum. No one turned. No one noticed. I had become what I had feared for years, not rejected, not remembered, just invisible. Outside, the afternoon had aged into early evening. The sun hung low behind the trees, and the parking lot shimmered with leftover heat rising from the asphalt. Cars were starting to leave in a quiet procession, engines humming, dresses rustling, laughter floating just above the noise. I stepped onto the stone path that led toward the reception hall. My shadow stretched long and thin behind me, trailing along the gravel like it was trying to return to the church. The reception was being held in the adjoining hall behind the church, a renovated space with high ceilings, pale wooden beams, and rows of folding chairs dressed in white. I had been in that room before, years ago, when Eleanor hosted community dinners or brought leftover food from church potlucks in plastic tubs marked with masking tape. Back then, the hall had smelled like casseroles, dust, and coffee in dented percolators. That smell had changed. Now, as I stepped through the glass doors, I was greeted by the sharp scent of catered hors d'oeuvres and synthetic vanilla candles. The air was cooler, air conditioning fighting the warmth of too many bodies packed close. Music played from unseen speakers, something contemporary, unfamiliar, too clean. A woman in a headset held a clipboard near the door and barely glanced at me. I moved past her unnoticed. Inside, the tables were already full, centerpieces glowing with battery-powered lights nestled in glass jars, name cards placed with practiced precision. My name wasn't among them. I had expected that. I scanned the room not for a seat, but for a corner, somewhere I could exist without disrupting the illusion of celebration. I found a small space near the drink table, behind a column half covered in tulle. I stood there, hands clasped behind my back, watching. The bride and groom were making their rounds, smiling, hugging, thanking people who meant more to them than I did. She still hadn't looked at me, or perhaps she had, and simply looked through me. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one. The glass was cold and wet with condensation. I raised it to my lips but didn't drink. The bubbles fizzed against my nose like static. I set it down on the nearest ledge and folded my arms. The room buzzed with a kind of joy I didn't belong to. People leaned toward each other with shining eyes and open mouths, full of stories I wasn't part of. Their laughter came in bursts, always too loud, always followed by the clink of glass or the shuffle of dresses brushing against polished shoes. I watched them from my place behind the column, and not one of them turned their head. I could have left. I should have. But I stayed. Not because I hoped for recognition, but because something inside me needed to bear witness. To prove to myself that I had been there, in the room, under the same lights, breathing the same air, even if no one saw me, even if no one wanted me to. They started bringing out the food, plates stacked high with buttered rolls, salmon with lemon, little bowls of salad topped with almonds. I didn't approach the buffet. There was no plate for me, no seat. I didn't want to eat anyway. Hunger felt out of place in a moment like this, too human, too needy. So I stayed in the corner, watching napkins unfold, watching forks and knives lifted like instruments in a silent orchestra. A man stood to give a toast, someone from the groom's family. His voice was round and confident, his jokes polished and safe. People laughed in the right places. The bride beamed. The groom touched her hand. I felt something crack inside me, but no one heard it. The sound was internal, like a bone shifting too far, a pressure that never becomes a scream. I slipped out to the hallway. It was quieter there, cooler, a narrow corridor lined with old photos of previous weddings, community events, scout meetings, faces I didn't know, smiling in frozen moments. I stood before one of the frames, an older black and white image of a bride being kissed on the cheek by her father. His hand was on her shoulder, and her eyes were closed, caught in the intimacy of trust. I stared at it for a long time, not because I envied it, but because I had once known it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket again. I didn't open it. I simply held it against my palm, letting its weight reassure me that I had not imagined everything that came before, that I had once been someone who mattered. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. 2 young women passed by, both holding drinks mid-laughter. They barely glanced at me. One adjusted her dress, the other checked her phone. I could have been a coat rack. I could have been part of the wall. I returned to the reception just in time to hear the music change. The bride and groom took the floor for their first dance. The crowd formed a circle around them, clapping, swaying, some filming on their phones. I couldn't see much from where I stood, but I didn't need to. I watched the shadows on the floor, the way her train moved, the flicker of his jacket, the impression of something elegant happening just out of reach. I thought then of Eleanor again, of the first dance we shared. In a small hall like this one, but dimmer, dustier, with a band that played too loud and shoes that squeaked on linoleum. We danced with our fingers interlaced like anchors. She had leaned into me, her head resting just under my chin, her breath warm against my neck. We had not needed to speak. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the room had brightened. The dance had ended. Applause filled the space like confetti. The bride curtsied. The groom bowed. The illusion complete. Still, no one looked toward me. I stayed for another 20 minutes, maybe 30. I watched them cut the cake. I watched them pose for photos. I watched them thank guests and accept gifts. I stood in the corner, a witness to a life that had outgrown me. And then I turned and walked away. No one called my name. No one asked where I was going. I slipped out through the same glass doors I had entered, the air outside now cooler, dusk settling like dust over the parking lot. I reached my car, opened the door, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The locket lay in my hand, still unopened. In the reflection of the windshield, I saw myself, not as I had once been, but as I truly was. And for a moment, I believed that being invisible might be the only way to stay honest. I sat in the car for a long time without starting the engine. The reception hall behind me pulsed with muffled music, the bass line thudding through glass and concrete like a distant heartbeat I no longer shared. Through the windshield, I watched the slow parade of guests laughing their way to their cars, shoes in hand, jackets slung over shoulders, cheeks flushed with wine and warmth. They existed in a world I had once helped create, now sealed off like a snow globe I could only observe from the outside. The air inside the car had gone stale. It smelled of old upholstery, warm plastic, and something faintly metallic, like forgotten pennies in a cup holder. I reached over and cracked the window. The autumn air slipped in, cool and dry, carrying with it the scent of grass and exhaust and pine needles crushed under tires. A breeze passed through, brushing my cheek like a hand that knew how to comfort once, but had since forgotten. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and brought out the locket. It lay in the center of my palm, unmoving, innocent. A quiet oval of silver that had outlasted its first owner, and now lived in the pockets of a man who no longer knew how to give it away. The metal caught the fading light from the parking lot lamps and glowed softly, like a coin worn smooth by hands that never stopped needing it. I studied it for a moment. The engravings on the back had thinned over time. EM, the letters slightly slanted, looped, almost childish in their delicacy. I had memorized the lines years ago, not just the initials, but the tiny scratches around them, like a sky of hairline stars you could only see if the light hit right. The chain was tangled slightly. One loop caught around itself. I unwound it slowly with my fingers, careful not to tug. The clasp still worked, a tiny hook and eye that had survived decades of use. I didn't open it right away. I just sat there, letting it rest in my palm, the weight of it heavier than I remembered. Or maybe I had grown lighter. This locket had been through more than any of us. Eleanor had worn it almost every day of our early years. I remembered watching her reach for it when she was nervous, her fingers always finding it, rubbing the edge with her thumb, like a rosary with only one bead. She wore it through pregnancies, funerals, anniversaries, long nights when the wind howled outside and neither of us slept. It had fallen into a drain once, and I spent half an hour with a bent wire fishing it out, hands raw from frustration and cold. She had kissed me on the forehead afterward. That kiss had lasted longer in my memory than the retrieval itself. I opened the locket. The hinge creaked slightly, just enough to be heard. Inside were the same 2 photographs, faded now, but whole. On the left, Eleanor, 25, her wedding veil pinned loosely, the corners of her smile betraying amusement, like the photographer had said something inappropriate, and she was holding back a laugh. On the right, our daughter, 7 years old, grinning too wide, one tooth missing, dandelions clutched in her small hands, the mailbox crooked in the background, my shadow visible behind the lens. That day had been hot, I remembered. The kind of heat that sticks to your neck and makes even plastic lawn chairs feel like iron. She had run toward me, barefoot. I ran a finger lightly over the edges of the photos. The paper was soft, almost velvety with age. The color had bled at the corners, leaving behind a quiet sepia that seemed older than memory itself. But the faces, her eyes, Eleanor's eyes, they stared up at me with a calm I could no longer summon in myself. This had been meant for her, for our daughter, not for today's version of her, not for the bride who hadn't seen me, for the little girl with dandelions. The one who had once fallen asleep with her head on my chest while Eleanor read aloud from a book about horses. The one who had stood on the couch cushions in her pajamas and told me I was the tallest man in the world. I closed the locket slowly, letting the clasp click shut with finality, and then I pressed it into my palm until the edges left shallow marks in my skin. I thought about walking back into the reception, about tapping her on the shoulder and placing it in her hand without a word, letting the silver speak what I no longer could. But I knew what would happen. The gesture would fold into discomfort. She'd take it politely, or maybe not at all. It would become a moment she'd recount later in hushed tones to someone who didn't know the full story, and it would lose its weight. It would become just another thing from a man who didn't know when to let go. So I sat there, holding the locket. I remembered when I first gave Eleanor a ring box with it inside. No occasion. Just a Tuesday. She opened it, saw the locket, and laughed softly before growing quiet. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She slipped it on immediately, then turned and started doing the dishes like nothing had changed. That was her way. The parking lot was nearly empty now. A few cars remained. One truck idled with its headlights on, painting a white beam across the side of the church wall. A moth fluttered through it in erratic loops. The driver finished his cigarette, flicked the ash out the window, and pulled away. I looked down at the locket again, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to weep. Not loud, not gasping, just the slow leak of pressure that builds behind silence. The kind of tears that don't ask for sympathy, only release. They slid down my face without resistance, caught on the edge of my chin, and fell onto the silver resting in my palm. I didn't wipe them away. Let it stay there, I thought. Let the salt mark it. Let it carry some part of me when I'm gone. Eventually, I placed the locket back into its box. The velvet lining was still intact, though dulled with time. I closed the lid and held it between both hands like something fragile, then tucked it gently into the glove compartment. I didn't lock it. Some things aren't meant to be sealed away. Some things need to be within reach, even if no one ever asks for them. I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes, and listened to the stillness again. The kind I had first felt in the church. The kind that didn't demand explanation or apology. It just was. And in that quiet, I no longer felt invisible. I felt like a man who had carried something across time and pain and silence, and still held it, even when no one noticed, even when no one would remember. When I returned home that evening, the house greeted me with the same silence it always did. Thick, immovable, patient. The door clicked shut behind me with a sound I knew too well, a sound that had marked the boundary between the world outside and the one I had come to occupy alone. I stood in the entryway for a moment, my hand still resting on the doorknob, keys dangling loosely from my fingers, their weight suddenly unbearable. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood, faded detergent, and something deeper, something only I could detect, perhaps, or maybe something that only loneliness could amplify. Dust had settled again on the radiator cover. A jacket I hadn't worn in months still hung on the hook. The light from the single lamp in the corner of the living room spread across the hardwood like honey, warm but slow, incapable of filling the shadows. I didn't turn on any more lights. I moved through the house by memory, passing the armchair where Eleanor used to sit with her knitting, past the side table with the chipped coaster I never replaced, and into the small study at the back of the house. This room had remained mostly untouched since she died. It held an order she had imposed long ago. Books arranged alphabetically, a desk facing the window, a lamp with a green glass shade, and a pull chain that clicked twice before the light settled. I reached into the top drawer of the desk and pulled out the letter. It had been sitting there for years, folded neatly, untouched, but not forgotten. The envelope was yellowing at the edges. The flap had never been sealed. Eleanor had written my name on the front in her deliberate script, the kind she used for holiday cards and grocery lists, each letter perfectly shaped, as if she were always trying to speak clearly through the page. I held it in my hand for a long time before sitting down. The chair creaked beneath me, just as it always did, the wood joints reminding me that nothing stays silent forever. The letter was dated 2 months before her diagnosis. Back then, everything still felt possible. We were older, yes, and moving slower, but the world hadn't yet shown us its closing hand. I remembered the day she placed the letter in the drawer. She didn't say what it was, only that one day it would matter. I unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet, lined, torn from a spiral-bound notebook. The edges still bore the soft perforations where it had been pulled out carefully, deliberately. Her handwriting remained steady, unshaken. No ink smudges, no second guesses. I read it once, and then again. Slowly. Each word landed like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling through me. She wrote about our daughter. She wrote about what she feared. She wrote about how love could curl into silence when disappointment became too loud, and how pride, once wounded, grew teeth. She wrote that if I ever found myself apart from our daughter, not by death, but by something colder, something unspoken, then I was not to chase her. Not with guilt, not with apologies sharpened into weapons, but with truth. Not every truth, Eleanor wrote, just the one that mattered. She reminded me that the locket wasn't about jewelry. It was about continuity, about memory that could be touched, about roots, even in soil that had turned hard. And if the day ever came when our daughter needed to be reminded of who she was, not the woman in the mirror, not the one in photographs, but the child who once ran through our kitchen with muddy shoes and a grin too wide for her face, I was to give her the locket, but only when I was ready to give it without expectation, only when I could offer it without asking for anything in return. I laid the letter on the desk and stared at it. My hand rested on the page, fingertips brushing the ink as if trying to summon her voice from the paper. The room around me hummed with its usual stillness, the faint tick of the wall clock, the sound of branches tapping the window outside, the distant groan of plumbing settling deep within the walls. But within me, the silence broke. I remembered the morning I taught our daughter how to tie her shoes. She had been so frustrated. The laces never did what she wanted them to do. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching, arms crossed, smiling without interfering. I had taken our daughter's hands in mine and guided her through the loops. Over, under, through. Her little fingers clumsy, but eager. And when she finally did it on her own, she looked up at me like I had handed her the world. That was the kind of love Eleanor had meant, not the kind that demanded, the kind that waited. I folded the letter and returned it to the drawer, not out of denial, but out of reverence. It had done its job. The words had passed through me, reshaping what I carried. I sat for a while longer in the study, my eyes scanning the spines of books she had arranged, titles I never read, topics she used to bring up over dinner when I had nothing left to say. On the windowsill sat a small ceramic bird, green, with a chip on one wing. It had belonged to her mother. Eleanor kept it there for reasons she never explained. I used to think it was a strange ornament, meaningless, but that night it felt like a sentinel, a witness to every silence we had shared and survived. I stood up and went into the hallway. In the hall closet, on the top shelf, inside an old tin box once filled with sewing supplies, was a photograph of the three of us, taken in the backyard during a 4th of July picnic. Our daughter was 10. Eleanor sat on the lawn chair with a glass of lemonade. I was beside her, arms around both. The sprinkler was running behind us. The photograph was faded, but you could still see the way we leaned into each other. Not because the camera told us to, but because we belonged in that frame. I took the photo and brought it into the study. I placed it beside the letter. Then I opened the drawer again and retrieved the locket from the glove box where I'd hidden it after the wedding. I placed it next to the photograph and letter, forming a quiet triangle of memory and weight. And I stood there, looking at the three of them, not as artifacts, but as instructions. When the time came, I would give her the locket, not to fix anything, not to explain, but to show that, even in absence, I had stayed. I had remembered. I had carried her with me through every silence, and in that, I believed she might finally hear me. I woke before the sun, as I often did, not because I set an alarm, but because something in me refused to let sleep carry me past the hour when the world still held its breath. The house was dark, quiet in that deep way that only comes just before morning, when even the creaks in the floorboards seem hesitant to break the stillness. I lay there in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, watching faint shadows shift along the plaster as headlights passed outside. The sheets smelled faintly of soap and dust. I hadn't changed them in weeks, not because I didn't care, but because there was something comforting in the worn-in smell, something steady. I reached over to the nightstand and turned on the small lamp. Its light was dull, amber-toned, softened by a yellowed shade that had survived 3 moves and 2 decades of turning on only when the rest of the house slept. The clock next to it, an old flip clock that still clicked softly each minute, read 5:16. The plastic numbers flipped slowly, with a sound like a page being turned in a distant book. I watched it turn to 5:17 before I sat up. My slippers waited exactly where they always were, toes pointed slightly inward. I slipped into them and stood, joints complaining. In the hallway, the wallpaper peeled slightly near the baseboard, curling like the edge of a dried leaf. I had meant to fix it more than once, but something always stopped me. Maybe the idea that the house, like me, had earned its imperfections. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The metal bottom clicked against the burner. I lit the flame and watched the blue ring catch. The kettle was dented on one side, a scar from a Thanksgiving decades ago when our daughter knocked it over while chasing the dog. Eleanor hadn't been angry. She'd laughed, loud and surprised, and said it gave the kettle more character. She was always forgiving of the broken things. I was still learning how to be. As I waited for the water to boil, I pulled a mug from the cupboard. The handle had a hairline crack through it, but I still used it. It had once belonged to Eleanor. It had small violets painted on the side, and a faint brown ring around the inside that never scrubbed out, no matter how much baking soda I used. I never tried too hard. The stain made it hers. I brewed a single cup of black tea. I didn't add sugar. I hadn't in years. The taste was sharp and bitter, but it kept me awake. kept me anchored. I carried the mug into the study and sat in the same chair as the night before. The light outside was changing now, frosted blue creeping along the window panes, revealing the outline of branches, telephone wires, a single crow perched on the neighbor's roof. The house exhaled with the faint thud of the furnace turning on. I wrapped my hands around the mug and let the warmth bleed into my fingers. The letter sat where I had left it, beside the photo, beside the locket. I looked at the three of them for a long time, no longer as objects, but as a conversation. There was something that had been forming in me since the moment I saw my daughter freeze in the doorway of the church. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something quieter, more solid, a kind of understanding that didn't ask for peace or revenge, just the right to choose my own part in the story. I picked up the locket again. I turned it over, opened it, looked at the faces, and then I set it back down on the desk, not in its box, not hidden away. I let it stay there, open, exposed, waiting. I stood and walked to the closet. At the back, behind the winter coats and moth-eaten scarves, behind a box of Eleanor's old holiday decorations and a stack of picture frames wrapped in newspaper, there was a small lockbox. I had kept it since our daughter was born. It once held birth certificates, insurance policies, a deed to a house we sold before she was 10. Over time, it had become a place for the personal things I didn't know how to share, things that were only meant to be found if someone truly needed to look. I brought the lockbox to the study and opened it with the key that had lived on my keyring so long. Its teeth were worn smooth. Inside were 3 items: a letter I had written, but never sent, apologizing for the years of silence after Eleanor's death, a pressed flower Eleanor had tucked into a book the week our daughter graduated high school. It had once been purple. Now it was the color of parchment, and a folded napkin from a diner, the first place I ever told Eleanor I loved her. She had written the date on it in blue pen. I had kept it without telling her. I added the locket, then the photo, then Eleanor's letter. I closed the box slowly, carefully, and returned it to the closet. Not to hide it, but to wait. To allow it to live in a place where it might one day be discovered, not given, not forced, but found, in the quiet way that truths sometimes rise when they are finally needed. I sat back down in the chair and watched the light stretch further into the room. Dust floated through it like drifting snow. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started too early. A dog barked once. The day had begun. I finished my tea. Then I stood and went into the living room. I took Eleanor's embroidered towel from the back of the door and finally folded it into the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. I took down the calendar she had left hanging in the kitchen and replaced it with a clean one, empty, but waiting. I washed the mug with the violet pattern and placed it on the shelf upside down so no dust would settle in it again. And then I sat in the silence, the new kind of silence, the kind that follows a decision not shouted or written, but lived. And I waited, not for her to return, not for her to call, but for the day when her hands, reaching for something familiar, might find the lockbox, and in opening it, understand everything I no longer needed to say. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in its stillness. A kind of deliberate quiet hung in the corners, as if the walls themselves had decided not to echo. I walked through the rooms, barefoot, the floorboards cool against my skin. The windows, still streaked with moisture from the night, let in gray light that spilled across the hardwood in slow, reluctant angles. There was no sound from the street, only the soft whisper of wind against the eaves. I didn't make tea that morning. Instead, I sat by the kitchen window with nothing in my hands, nothing on the table but the coaster with Eleanor's old lipstick stain faintly pressed into the fabric. I had stopped trying to wash it out years ago. The stain had become a mark of presence rather than a flaw, a small reminder that something had once been there and stayed long enough to leave a trace. My suitcase stood by the door, not packed with much, just a few changes of clothes, my watch, a shaving kit, and a folded raincoat I hadn't worn in over a year. The zipper was stiff, and the handle had cracked on one side, but it still closed like it always had. The bag had seen airports, funerals, cheap motels, and hospital waiting rooms. It had sat on floors where no one spoke, and by bedsides where the only words said were goodbyes. It carried weight even when empty. I walked to the living room and turned off the lamp with the yellowed shade. The chain clicked twice, as always. The bulb gave one last flicker before fading into a memory of light. I unplugged it gently and coiled the cord behind the table. I didn't plan to be gone long, but I knew enough now not to assume anything about return. On the hallway wall, I paused beside the row of framed photographs. There was one of our daughter holding a sparkler at age 5, her eyes wide with wonder and light streaking through the air like a comet. Another, from a vacation in the mountains, Eleanor in a wool sweater, the wind in her hair, her face half hidden in the collar as she laughed at something I had said, and then immediately forgotten. I didn't touch the glass. I just stood there, looking. I didn't lock the front door when I stepped outside. There was nothing in the house worth stealing. What mattered had already been carried out, in one form or another. Memory doesn't live in furniture or keepsakes. It lives in the spaces between what we remember and what we choose not to. The sky was overcast. A pale white film stretched across the clouds like gauze, the kind of sky that threatened neither rain nor sun, just a low ceiling that pressed the world down a little. The wind tugged lightly at my coat as I made my way down the steps. Leaves gathered in the corners of the porch. One had gotten caught in the screen door. I let it stay there. My car started with a reluctant rumble, the engine sounding older than I remembered. The smell of gasoline and cold air filled the cabin. I adjusted the mirror out of habit and saw my own eyes looking back, lined, red-rimmed, but steady. Behind me, the house stood in perfect stillness. The curtains in the front room hung motionless, the porch light still off, the yard quiet except for a squirrel darting across the drive. I didn't look back again after I pulled away. The road was empty. I drove with the radio off. The silence inside the car matched the landscape outside. Fields half-harvested, trees brittle and turning, fences leaning under the weight of years. I passed by places I used to know. The diner where Eleanor and I had ordered the same breakfast for 2 decades. The park where our daughter once flew a kite so high it disappeared into the clouds and cried because she thought it had gone to heaven. I slowed at each of these places without stopping, letting the recognition wash over me without crashing in. At the edge of town, I pulled over and parked near the overlook. It wasn't marked on any map, just a worn shoulder where the land dropped into a small valley. I used to bring Eleanor here when we were first dating. We would sit on the hood of the car and count stars, drinking warm soda from glass bottles and pretending we understood constellations. She would talk about growing old. I would talk about not thinking that far ahead. The valley hadn't changed. The fields below still undulated like slow waves, barns scattered like islands, cattle like dark punctuation marks in an unwritten sentence. I rolled down the window and let the wind in. It smelled like earth, sharp and sweet, like something waking up from a long sleep. I reached into the glove compartment and touched the box where the locket had been. It was still there, now holding more than just silver and photographs. It held silence and apology, and the kind of love that survives being unseen. I didn't open it. I didn't need to anymore. I sat there for nearly an hour, listening to nothing, watching the wind brush through the fields. Eventually, I turned the car around and headed west, not toward any particular destination, but away from one. I didn't call anyone. I didn't leave a note. I trusted that what needed to find me would. The road unfurled in front of me like a ribbon someone had let go of. I drove slowly. There was no urgency now, no plan, just the knowledge that staying had become heavier than going. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was returning to something, even if I didn't yet know what. I came back 3 days later, though I hadn't told anyone I'd left, and no one had asked where I'd gone. The driveway was exactly as I'd left it, cracked along the edges, a single strip of moss threading through the middle like a vein. The mailbox leaned a little farther forward than it used to, its red flag long since rusted in place. A newspaper wrapped in plastic sat at the bottom of the steps, soggy from 2 nights of dew and silence. I let the engine idle for a moment before I turned it off. The ticking of the cooling metal filled the space around me, that slow mechanical heartbeat that always made the silence after driving feel heavier than it should. I didn't grab the suitcase from the back seat. I just opened the door and stepped out into the fading afternoon. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. Someone down the block had started burning something in a metal drum, the way old-timers did in autumn. The air stung faintly at the back of my throat, and I welcomed the discomfort. It reminded me I was back in a place that had a scent, a season, a history. The house stood still, not waiting, not watching, just there. A rectangle of memory framed by siding and shutters, the roof sagging slightly over the porch like a tired brow. The paint had started to peel around the windows, where moisture collected every winter. I had once told Eleanor I'd repaint it. That was years ago. I stepped up the front stairs slowly, feeling the give of the second plank beneath my heel. It had always been soft, always groaned, even after I tried reinforcing it with a scrap of oak. Some things didn't want to be fixed. They just wanted to be recognized. The key turned in the lock with a gritty protest. The door opened, and the house inhaled. Inside, the air was still, cool. The smell of old paper and wood polish, faint coffee, something floral that had clung to the curtains for years. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting the familiar sounds emerge. The refrigerator's hum, the soft creak of the hallway vent, the ticking of the kitchen clock that hung slightly askew over the pantry door. I didn't call out. There was no one to answer. I walked through the front room, running my hand along the top of the sofa, brushing dust from the fabric. A book lay face down on the armrest, one I had been pretending to read for weeks. The spine cracked easily, the pages yellowed at the edges. I left it there. In the kitchen, the mug with violets still sat upside down on the dish rack, where I'd left it after washing it the morning I left. The dish towel, once white, had grayed from years of use, its corners frayed into soft wisps. The wall calendar was still turned to the previous month. I flipped it to the next page, more out of habit than intention. September. A month of endings, always. School years, summers, warmth. I boiled water and made tea, not because I wanted it, but because the ritual gave my hands something to do. I watched the steam curl up from the kettle, watched the way it moved toward the window and vanished before reaching the glass. I held the mug in both hands and didn't drink. I stood in the doorway of the study, my shoulder pressed lightly against the frame, and looked at the desk. The letter was still there. The photo, the locket, all untouched, arranged like a shrine or a confession. I didn't approach them. I let them stay just as I had left them, preserved in intention. The desk lamp with the green glass shade cast a soft semicircle of light across the wood. Dust danced in the beam, slow and weightless, like time forgetting itself. I went upstairs, the steps creaking in a familiar pattern. 4th step, loudest. 7th, nearly silent. At the top, I turned right, passing the closed door of what had once been our daughter's room. I didn't open it. Not that day. I moved to the bedroom instead, where the sheets had remained unrumpled, the corners still tucked the way I had left them, hospital tight from an old habit I never unlearned. I sat on the edge of the bed, The mattress gave beneath me with a sigh. I looked around the room. The dresser with its uneven knobs, the mirror streaked faintly at the edges, the small porcelain box on Eleanor's nightstand, where she used to keep her earrings. It still held one pair, opal studs she wore only on Sundays. I hadn't touched them since she passed. I didn't know why I hadn't given them away. Maybe because some things are only valuable in their stillness. On the wall above the bed hung a print of a painting Eleanor had loved. A winter landscape, birch trees, a woman in a red scarf walking alone across a frozen field. There was something about it, how small she looked in that vast white space, that had always unsettled me. Eleanor once told me she liked it because the woman looked content, not lost. I had never seen it that way. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The fan above spun slowly, making a low clicking sound with each rotation. I let my eyes follow the motion until they blurred. My fingers rested lightly on my chest, over the spot where the locket had been pressed the night before I left. I could still feel its outline, the weight of it, even though it was now sitting quietly in the box downstairs. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, letting the hours pass without demanding anything from them. Outside, the sky darkened, the wind picked up, and a soft tapping began against the window, branches brushing glass, like fingers too hesitant to knock. Eventually I rose. I went downstairs again, turning off lights as I moved through the house, not because anyone might see them, but because the rooms felt better in the dark. I returned to the study, picked up the photograph, and looked at it in the pool of light cast by the desk lamp. I held it for a long time, not trying to go back, not trying to change it, just holding it, like something alive, something breathing beneath the paper. Then I returned it to its place. I turned off the lamp. The room went dark, and the house once again became still. It happened in the most ordinary way, the kind of moment so subtle, so quiet, it almost passed without being noticed. I was in the backyard, trimming the hydrangeas that had overgrown near the fence. My shears were dull, and the clippings fell in uneven piles at my feet. A breeze moved through the grass, brushing against my ankles like an old dog begging for attention. The light was thin. Autumn had softened it, stretched it across the sky in long bands that looked more like memory than color. The air smelled of soil and rusted metal. Somewhere nearby, someone was raking leaves, and the scrape of tines on pavement drifted faintly over the fence. I had already filled half a brown paper lawn bag when I heard the mailbox creak. Not slam, not snap, just that soft metallic groan as it was opened, and then gently closed again. I waited a minute before walking around to the front. I took the long way, past the window with the cracked shutter, past the edge of the porch where the wood had warped in the last rainstorm. I moved slowly, my gloves still on, holding the shears in one hand like a symbol of something finished, but not yet discarded. The envelope was white, no return address, just my name. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. The light from the window caught the paper in such a way that I could see the faint curve of ink beneath the fold, the slope of the pen against the grain. I washed my hands at the sink first, letting the water run longer than necessary, watching it swirl around my fingers before disappearing down the drain. The soap smelled like rosemary, the same brand I'd used since Eleanor passed, the bottle now crusted around the pump from months of slow use. When I finally opened the envelope, I did so carefully, sliding my finger under the flap as if the paper itself might bruise. The handwriting was hers, not the childish scrawl from old birthday cards or the school permission slips I used to sign without reading. This was the hand of a woman grown, controlled, confident. There was a curve in the Y's that reminded me of Eleanor. The letter wasn't long. It didn't apologize. It didn't ask questions. It simply said she had found the box. She didn't say where. She didn't say when. Just that she had opened it. She said she had held the locket in her palm for a long time before realizing what it was. She said the photo had made her cry, not because of what had been lost, but because of what had been kept. She said she'd read her mother's letter 3 times before setting it down, and each time, a different sentence struck her harder than the last. She didn't say she forgave me. She didn't need to. The final line was the only one I read more than once. "Thank you for not making me look for you, but for leaving something behind that let me find myself." I folded the letter and set it on the table, beside the locket box, which had remained there since I'd taken it from the closet. The sunlight moved across both like a slow tide, warming the silver until it caught in the corner of my eye, a quiet spark that reminded me of nothing flashy, nothing triumphant, just presence. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. I didn't cry. I didn't stand and pace. I just sat there, breathing in the scent of rosemary soap and afternoon dust, listening to the steady tick of the clock above the stove. It was an old clock, battery-operated, shaped like a teacup, gifted to us on our 20th anniversary by someone neither of us had spoken to since. But it ticked on, reliable, unassuming. That was the sound of it, I realized, the sound of things continuing. I made tea, not because I needed it, but because I wanted something warm in my hands. I reached again for the mug with the violets, and this time I didn't hesitate. I placed the letter beneath it, not to hide it, but to anchor it. As I drank, I let my gaze drift through the kitchen window, to the tree in the neighbor's yard, where the last of the yellow leaves clung stubbornly to the branches. I thought of all the things I had wanted to say that I never could. How language had failed me more often than silence. How silence, in the end, had given me more room to move. Not escape, just room. To breathe, to wait, to stay still long enough for the past to catch up and gently tap on my shoulder without bitterness. That was the victory, I understood. Not a speech, not a reconciliation staged for comfort or closure, but a small shift, a returned glance, a letter on the table folded with care. I finished the tea and washed the cup. I dried it with a towel Eleanor embroidered decades ago, the one I never used because it felt too precious. The thread had begun to fray at the edges, and I followed its path with my fingertip, from the loop of an M to the cross of a T, initials of a name she once wrote without hesitation. I hung the towel back carefully. Then I opened the window, just a little, enough to let the breeze in. It smelled like wood smoke and the far-off sweetness of apples rotting in grass. Enough to remind me the season had changed. Enough to remind me I was still here.